I sat on the edge of our bed, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting a warm light over the room. My heart felt heavy, weighed down by a mixture of sadness and confusion. Thomas was in the bathroom, the sound of running water a distant murmur. I thought back to our wedding night, the night I had saved myself for, the night I had believed would be the start of our beautiful life together. Thomas walked out, rubbing a towel through his damp hair. He looked at me briefly, then turned his attention to his dresser, picking out clothes for the next day. I gathered my courage, hoping to bridge the gap that had grown between us. "Thomas, do you remember our wedding night?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He glanced at me, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Of course I do, Willow. Why?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. I thought it was special. I saved myself for you, Thomas. It was supposed to mean something." He sighed, clearly exasperated. "Really, Willow? You act like you gave me a gold medal or something. It's not that big of a deal." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had always believed that preserving my virginity was a precious gift, something sacred and unique. Tears welled up in my eyes as I tried to make him understand. "But it was a big deal to me, Thomas. I thought you'd appreciate it," I whispered, my voice breaking. Thomas turned to face me, his expression hardening. "Willow, you're making too much out of this, so you stayed at home and didn't date anyone else. That doesn't make you special. It just means you didn't have a life before we got married." I felt a lump rise in my throat, my hands trembling. I did it for us, for our future. I thought it would bring us closer. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "Willow, I'm tired of this constant need for validation. You always want me to praise you for every little thing. Can't you just be content with what we have?" I blinked back tears, my mind racing. "But I need to feel appreciated, Thomas. I need to know that you value me and what I do." He let out a frustrated sigh, sitting down on the edge of the bed, his back to me. "I do value you, but you can't expect me to worship you all the time. It's exhausting. I have my own life, my own problems." I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged it off. "Thomas, please, I'm just asking for a little appreciation, a little acknowledgement." He stood up abruptly, turning to face me with a look of sheer frustration. "You know what, Willow? Maybe you need to find your own worth instead of relying on me to make you feel good about yourself." His words stung, and I felt a sob rise in my throat. "Is that really how you feel?" He nodded, his expression softening slightly but still firm. "Yes, Willow, I'm sorry if it hurts, but you need to hear it. You can't keep demanding this from me. It's too much." I sat there, tears streaming down my face, feeling more alone than ever. Thomas turned away, heading back to the bathroom, leaving me to grapple with the overwhelming sense of disappointment that threatened to swallow me whole. In that moment, I realized that the gap between us was wider than I had ever imagined, and I didn't know if we could ever bridge it. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a golden hue over our bedroom. Thomas was already up, bustling around, getting ready for work. I lay in bed, still reeling from our conversation the night before. The house felt heavy with unspoken words and unresolved tension. "Thomas, can we talk?" I asked, my voice still groggy from sleep. He paused, glancing at me briefly before continuing to button his shirt. "I don't have time for this right now, Willow. I'm running late." I sat up, clutching the blanket to my chest. "Please, just for a minute. I need to understand what's happening between us." He sighed, turning to face me, his expression one of weariness. "Willow, we've been over this. You want too much from me. I can't give you what you're looking for." I felt a pang of frustration. "I'm not asking for much, Thomas. Just a little appreciation, a little acknowledgement for what I do." He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "And I keep telling you, it's exhausting. Every day it's something new. Thomas, did you notice the dinner I made, Thomas? Do you like my new dress, Thomas? Am I doing enough? It's never ending, Willow. I can't keep up." I looked down, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. I just want to feel valued. Is that so wrong? He sighed again, softer this time. No, it's not wrong. But you need to find that value in yourself, not from me. I can't be the one to make you feel good about yourself all the time. I frowned, trying to hold back tears. But we're supposed to support each other, right? Isn't that what marriage is about? He looked at me, a mixture of frustration and pity in his eyes. Yes, we support each other, but it's supposed to be balanced. Right now it feels like all I do is try to keep you happy, and it's wearing me down. I felt a lump form in my throat. I didn't realize you felt that way. Thomas nodded, his expression softening. I know you didn't, and I don't want to hurt you, Willow. But something has to change. I can't keep doing this. I looked away, staring at the floor. What do you want me to do? He took a deep breath. I want you to start finding your own happiness, your own sense of worth. You can't rely on me for that. It's not fair to either of us. I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me. I don't know how. Thomas walked over, placing a hand on my shoulder. You have to try, Willow, for both our sakes. I looked up at him, searching his eyes for any sign of the love and affection we once shared. But all I saw was exhaustion and a desire for change. He straightened up, glancing at the clock. I have to go. We'll talk more later, okay? I nodded, feeling a heavy weight settle in my chest. As he walked out the door, I couldn't help but wonder if we could ever find our way back to each other, or if we were destined to drift further apart. The frustration in his voice echoed in my mind, and I knew that finding a solution would be more difficult than I had ever imagined. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between Thomas and me grew even wider. I tried to take his words to heart, to find my own sense of worth, but it was difficult. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of self-doubt and loneliness. Every time I reached out to Thomas, he seemed more distant, more uninterested. One evening, after a particularly long and lonely day, I decided to confront him again. He was sitting in the living room, absorbed in his work, his laptop glowing in the dim light. Thomas, can we talk? I asked, standing hesitantly in the doorway. He looked up, his face tired. What is it, Willow? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. I feel like we're drifting apart. I don't know how to fix it. He sighed, closing his laptop. Willow, we've had this conversation so many times. What do you want me to say? I walked over and sat down next to him, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. I just want us to be close again. I want to feel like you care. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. I do care, but I can't be everything for you, Willow. You need to find some independence. It's not healthy to rely on me for all your emotional needs. I felt a spark of anger. I'm not asking for everything, Thomas. Just some support. Is that too much? He shook his head, his frustration evident. It feels like it is. You always need something from me. I can't even relax without you needing reassurance or attention. It's suffocating. My eyes filled with tears. I don't mean to suffocate you. I don't know how to be without you. He looked at me, his expression softening slightly. Willow, you need to learn. You need to find your own strength. I looked away, feeling the tears spill over. I don't know if I can. Thomas stood up, running a hand through his hair. You have to try. For both of us. I watched him walk away, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. I wanted to scream, to make him understand how much I was hurting, but I knew it wouldn't help. The resentment inside me was growing, feeding off every argument, every cold shoulder, every dismissive comment. The next morning, I decided to throw myself into the household chores, hoping to find some sense of accomplishment. I cooked a lavish breakfast, hoping to surprise Thomas. But when he came downstairs, he barely glanced at the food. Not hungry, he muttered, grabbing a piece of toast and heading for the door. I felt the sting of his dismissal. I made all this for you. Can't you at least sit down and eat with me? He turned, an exasperated look on his face. "Willow, I appreciate the effort, but I don't have time for this. I have a lot of work to do." I watched him leave, my frustration boiling over. I had tried so hard to please him, to make our home a place of comfort and love, but nothing seemed to matter. The more I tried, the more he pulled away. That evening I decided to confront him once and for all. I couldn't keep living like this, feeling like a burden in my own home. "Thomas, we need to talk," I said, standing in front of him as he sat on the couch. He sighed, looking up at me. "What now, Willow?" I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep feeling like I'm not enough for you." He stood up, his face hardening. "And I can't keep feeling like I'm being smothered. You need to find something else to focus on besides me." I felt a rush of anger. "I have tried, but every time I do something you ignore it or criticize it. I feel like nothing I do matters." Thomas shook his head, his frustration evident. "It's not that it doesn't matter. It's just that you can't expect me to be the source of all your happiness. It's too much pressure." I looked at him, tears streaming down my face. Then what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to find happiness when you make me feel so worthless? He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know, Willow, but you need to figure it out. I can't do it for you." As he walked away, I felt the weight of his words settle over me. The resentment inside me had grown too large to ignore. I knew that something had to change, but I didn't know how to make it happen. The gap between us seemed insurmountable, and I was left wondering if we would ever find our way back to each other. I sat on the floor of our bedroom, surrounded by open suitcases and piles of clothes. My hands shook as I folded another shirt, tears blurring my vision. It felt surreal, packing up my life after such a short marriage. As I moved through the motions, my mind kept drifting back to where it all began, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. Thomas was at work, giving me the solitude I needed to process everything. I picked up a photo from our wedding day, the two of us smiling, looking so hopeful and happy. How did we get from that moment to this? I remembered our wedding night, how I had saved myself for Thomas, thinking it was the ultimate gift. I wanted it to be special, a moment we would cherish forever. But instead, his dismissive response had left me feeling empty and unappreciated. "Really, Willow? You act like you gave me a gold medal or something," Thomas had said, his words still echoing in my mind. I had wanted to scream, to make him see how much it meant to me, but I had stayed silent, hoping he would come around. As I packed, I kept replaying the moments of our relationship in my head, searching for signs that I had missed. The red flags were there, but I had been too blinded by love and hope to see them. I thought back to the beginning, when we first met. It was Grandmother Emma who had introduced us, convinced that we were a perfect match. She was our nosy but well-meaning neighbour, always looking out for me. "Willow, dear, come here for a second," Grandmother Emma had called out to me one afternoon. I was heading home from work, and she was standing on her porch, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "Hi, Grandmother Emma. What's up?" I asked, smiling as I approached her. "I have someone I want you to meet," she said, her voice full of anticipation. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, who's that?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Just a nice young man who lives nearby. I think you two would get along wonderfully." I laughed, shaking my head. "You and your matchmaking. Who is it this time?" She beckoned me closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "His name is Thomas. He's a good, hard-working man. I've known his family for years. I really think you two would be a great match." I hesitated, but her enthusiasm was infectious. "All right, I'll meet him." Our first meeting was awkward but sweet. Thomas was shy, and I found his reserved nature endearing. We started dating, and for a while, everything seemed perfect. But looking back, I realized that I had ignored the signs of his emotional distance and his difficulty expressing affection. One evening, a few months into our relationship, I had brought up the topic of our future. "Thomas, where do you see us in 5 years?" I asked, cuddled up next to him on the couch. He shrugged, staring at the TV. I don't know. I guess we'll just see how things go. I frowned, feeling a pang of disappointment. Don't you have any dreams or plans for us? He sighed, turning to face me. Willow, why do you always need to plan everything? Can't we just enjoy the present? I bit my lip, feeling like I was asking for too much. I just want to know that we're on the same page. He gave me a small smile, squeezing my hand. We are. Let's not worry about the future so much, okay? I had brushed off his reluctance to plan, convincing myself that it was just his way of being practical. But now I saw it as a sign of his emotional unavailability. He had always been distant, and I had tried to bridge that gap, only to find myself falling into it. Packing up my things, I felt a mix of regret and sadness. I had poured so much of myself into our marriage, hoping to build a life together, but it had all crumbled around me. I glanced at the photo one last time before placing it in a box. As I packed the last of my belongings, I realized that I had lost myself in my attempts to be the perfect wife. I had focused so much on Thomas's needs and desires that I had neglected my own. It was time to rediscover who I was and what I wanted from life. With a deep breath, I zipped up the suitcase and stood up. It was time to move on, to find my own path. I didn't know what the future held, but I was determined to face it with strength and courage. As I continued packing, my mind wandered to Thomas's background. Understanding his past might help me make sense of our present. I remembered the few times he had opened up about his childhood and the strong influence his mother had on him. Thomas grew up in a small, 2-bedroom apartment with his mother, Margaret. His father had left when Thomas was just a baby, leaving Margaret to raise him on her own. She worked multiple jobs to make ends meet and instilled in Thomas a fierce sense of independence and self-reliance. However, she also instilled a deep-seated mistrust of women, constantly warning him that they were only after his money or would leave him just like his father. One evening, early in our relationship, Thomas had shared a rare glimpse into his past. Willow, I never told you much about my dad, did I? He said, his voice low and serious as we sat on the couch. I shook my head, curious. No, you haven't. What happened to him? Thomas sighed, staring into his glass of water. He left us when I was just a baby. Mom never really talked about him much, but I could tell it hurt her a lot. I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. I'm so sorry, Thomas. That must have been hard for both of you. He nodded, a distant look in his eyes. Yeah, it was. Mum worked so hard to make sure I had everything I needed, but she was always bitter about it. She'd always say things like, "Don't trust women, Thomas. They'll just use you and leave you." I frowned, feeling a pang of sadness for him. That must have been tough to hear. Thomas shrugged, taking a sip of his water. I guess it was her way of protecting me. She didn't want me to go through what she did. Margaret's influence on Thomas was profound. He had grown up believing that emotional vulnerability was a weakness and that relying on others, especially women, would only lead to heartache. This belief had shaped his interactions with everyone, including me. One afternoon, not long after we were married, Thomas and I visited his childhood home. Margaret was there, a stern woman with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. "Thomas, darling, come here and help me with this," Margaret called from the kitchen. Thomas immediately went to assist her, leaving me standing awkwardly in the living room. I wandered over to a bookshelf, glancing at the family photos. There were only a few, mostly of Thomas as a child and some older black and white pictures of his grandparents. Margaret appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. "Willow, dear, would you like some tea?" I smiled, trying to make a good impression. "Yes, thank you, Mrs. King." As she busied herself in the kitchen, I could hear her talking to Thomas in hushed tones. "You need to be careful, Thomas. Women will take advantage of your kindness," she said, her voice carrying into the living room. Thomas's response was quieter, but I caught snippets. "Mum, Willow's not like that. She's different." Margaret huffed. "They're all the same, Thomas. Just remember what I taught you." I felt a chill run down my spine, Margaret's words echoed the sentiments Thomas had expressed during our arguments. Her distrust of women had seeped into Thomas, creating a barrier between us that I struggled to break through. Another time, Thomas opened up about his mother during one of our late-night conversations. "Mum always warned me about women," he said, staring at the ceiling as we lay in bed. "She'd tell me horror stories about how her friends' husbands left them, or how women took everything in a divorce." I turned to face him, my heart aching for the boy he had been. "That sounds really harsh, Thomas. It's no wonder you have a hard time trusting." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I guess it messed me up a bit, but I always felt like she was just trying to protect me." I reached out, taking his hand in mine. "I'm not like that, Thomas. I love you for who you are, not for what you have." He squeezed my hand, but the shadow of doubt lingered in his eyes. "I know, Willow. It's just hard to shake off years of conditioning." Understanding Thomas's background helped me see why he struggled with emotional intimacy and why he found it difficult to appreciate my efforts. His mother's teachings had left deep scars, making it hard for him to open up and trust fully. As much as I wanted to help him heal, I realized that he needed to confront these issues on his own. As I packed the last of my things, I felt a mixture of empathy and sadness for Thomas. He was a product of his upbringing, and while that didn't excuse his behavior, it did help me understand it better. Our journey together had been fraught with challenges, but perhaps this separation would give us both the space we needed to grow and heal. I packed my last suitcase and let my mind drift back to the beginning, to when Thomas and I first met. It was Grandmother Emma who had introduced us, playing the role of a well-meaning but meddlesome neighbour. She was a sweet old lady with a knack for matchmaking, always eager to see the young people in the neighbourhood pair up. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and I was in my small garden, tending to the flowers. Grandmother Emma's voice floated over the fence. "Willow, dear, come here for a moment," she called out, her voice filled with excitement. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked over to the fence. "Yes, Grandmother Emma." She smiled warmly, her eyes twinkling. "I want you to meet someone. He's a nice young man who just moved in a few blocks away. His name is Thomas." I raised an eyebrow, curious but hesitant. "Oh? Why do you want me to meet him?" She chuckled, waving her hand dismissively. "I think you two would get along splendidly. He's a good, hard-working man, and you, my dear, are a lovely young lady. Just give it a try." I laughed, shaking my head. All right. I'll meet him." Later that week, Grandmother Emma invited both of us over for tea. I arrived first, nervously smoothing out my dress. Grandmother Emma had set up a charming little table in her garden, complete with a teapot and an assortment of cookies. "Willow, you look lovely," she said, greeting me with a hug. "Thank you, Grandmother Emma." "I'm a little nervous," I admitted, glancing around. She patted my hand reassuringly. "Don't worry, dear. Just be yourself." A few minutes later, Thomas arrived. He was tall, with a quiet demeanour and kind eyes. He looked a bit nervous too, which put me at ease. "Thomas, this is Willow," Grandmother Emma said, introducing us. "Willow, this is Thomas." We exchanged polite greetings, and Grandmother Emma ushered us to the table. As we sat down, she poured the tea and started chatting away, leaving little room for awkward silence. "So, Thomas, tell us a bit about yourself," Grandmother Emma prompted. Thomas cleared his throat, glancing at me. "Well, I recently moved here for work. I'm an accountant. I enjoy hiking and woodworking in my spare time." I smiled, feeling a bit more relaxed. "That's great. I love hiking too. There's a beautiful trail not far from here that I go to often." His eyes lit up. "Really? I'd love to check it out sometime." Grandmother Emma beamed, clearly pleased with the conversation, you see. You already have something in common. Over the next few weeks, Thomas and I started spending more time together. Our initial awkwardness gave way to comfortable companionship. We went for hikes, had dinners, and slowly got to know each other. He was reserved, but I found his quiet strength reassuring. One evening, after a pleasant hike, we sat down on a bench overlooking the valley. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. "Willow, I've really enjoyed getting to know you," Thomas said, breaking the comfortable silence. I smiled, feeling a warm flutter in my chest. "Me too, Thomas. I'm glad Grandmother Emma introduced us." He looked at me, his expression serious. "I know I'm not the most expressive person, but I want you to know that I really care about you." Touched by his sincerity, I reached out and took his hand. "I care about you too, Thomas." Our relationship grew steadily, and before long, Thomas proposed. It wasn't a grand, romantic gesture, but it was heartfelt and sincere. We were sitting in his living room, sharing a quiet evening together. "Willow," he began, his voice steady but nervous, "I know this might seem sudden, but I think we're good for each other. Will you marry me?" I looked into his eyes, seeing the genuine care and hope there. "Yes, Thomas, I will." We had a small, intimate wedding, with Grandmother Emma as our honorary guest. She was overjoyed, claiming credit for our union. For a while, everything seemed perfect. We settled into married life, navigating the usual ups and downs with a sense of partnership. But as time went on, the differences between us became more apparent. Thomas's emotional distance and my need for validation created a growing rift. Despite my efforts to bridge the gap, his past and my insecurities kept pulling us apart. As I finished packing, I couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia for those early days. Meeting Thomas had felt like the start of a beautiful journey, and for a while it was. But somewhere along the way we had lost our path. Now, it was time to find our way back, even if it meant walking separate roads. I zipped up the last suitcase, taking one final look around the room. The memories we had built together were bittersweet, but they were a part of my story. And as I stepped out of the house, I carried those memories with me, ready to face whatever came next. The first few months of marriage were a whirlwind of adjustments and new routines. I tried to be the perfect wife, believing that if I put in enough effort, Thomas would reciprocate. I cooked elaborate meals, kept the house spotless, and always greeted him with a smile when he came home from work. But despite my best efforts, Thomas remained distant and indifferent. One evening, after a long day at work, Thomas came home looking exhausted. I had prepared his favorite meal, hoping it would cheer him up. "Thomas, dinner's ready," I called out as he walked through the door. He glanced at the table, barely acknowledging the spread. "Thanks, Willow." "I'm not very hungry," he muttered, loosening his tie. I felt a pang of disappointment. "I made your favorite, though. Come on, sit down and eat with me." He sighed and reluctantly sat at the table. We ate in silence, the only sound being the clinking of utensils against plates. I kept stealing glances at him, hoping for some sign of appreciation, but his expression remained blank. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Thomas, is everything okay? You seem so distant lately." He looked up, his brow furrowing. "Willow, I'm just tired. Work has been stressful." I reached out, placing a hand on his. "I understand, but I feel like we're drifting apart. We hardly talk anymore." He pulled his hand away, rubbing his temples. "I'm sorry, Willow, I just have a lot on my mind." I bit my lip, trying to hold back tears. "I feel like nothing I do matters to you. I cook, I clean, I try to make our home nice, but you don't seem to care." Thomas sighed, pushing his plate away. "It's not that I don't care, it's hard for me to show it. I've always been like this." I looked down at my hands, feeling the weight of his words. "But I need to feel appreciated, Thomas. I need to know that you value what I do." He stood up, running a hand through his hair. "I do value it, Willow, but you can't expect me to be someone I'm not." Days turned into weeks, and the tension between us continued to build. Our conversations became more strained, filled with unspoken frustrations. I tried to find ways to connect with Thomas, but he always seemed to be one step ahead, retreating further into himself. One evening, after another silent dinner, I decided to confront him again. "Thomas, we need to talk," I said, standing in front of him as he sat on the couch, staring at his laptop. He looked up, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "What is it, Willow?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm unhappy, Thomas. I feel like I'm living with a stranger." He sighed, closing his laptop. "Willow, we've been over this. I don't know what you want from me." I felt a surge of frustration. "I want you to show me that you care. I want you to appreciate the things I do for you." He shook his head, standing up. "I do appreciate them, but I can't give you the constant validation you need. It's too much." I stared at him, tears welling up in my eyes. Why is it too much to ask for a little appreciation? A little love. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, looking exhausted. "Because it's never enough, Willow. No matter what I do, you always want more." The arguments became more frequent, and the distance between us grew. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, afraid to say or do anything that might upset him. The resentment inside me was building, and I didn't know how to stop it. One night, after a particularly heated argument, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the walls. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped in a marriage that was slowly suffocating me. Thomas came downstairs, his expression grim. "Willow, we can't keep doing this. This constant fighting isn't good for either of us." I looked up at him, my eyes red from crying. "I know, Thomas, but I don't know how to fix it." He sighed, sitting down next to me. "Maybe we need some time apart, to figure things out." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "You want a separation?" He shook his head. "Not necessarily, just some space, to think." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. "Okay, maybe some space is what we need." The days that followed were filled with a heavy silence. We went through the motions of daily life, barely speaking to each other. I threw myself into my work and hobbies, trying to find some semblance of happiness. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I realized that I couldn't keep living like this. I needed to find my own happiness, my own sense of worth. I couldn't rely on Thomas to provide it for me. With a heavy heart, I began to pack my things. It was time to take control of my life and find my own path, even if it meant walking away from the man I had once loved so deeply. The tension between Thomas and Willow had reached its breaking point. Days of simmering resentment and unspoken frustrations finally culminated in a confrontation that neither of them could avoid. It was a chilly evening when Thomas came home from work to find Willow sitting on the couch, a suitcase packed beside her. "What's going on?" Willow Thomas asked, his voice tight with concern. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but determined. "Thomas, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay between us." He frowned, sitting down beside her. "Are you leaving?" Willow nodded, her throat tight. "I think it's best for both of us." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his voice. "Damn it, Willow. Can't we just talk about this?" "We've been talking," Thomas, she replied softly. "But nothing ever changes. We're stuck in this cycle of unhappiness, and I don't see a way out." He sighed heavily, staring at the floor. "I never wanted this." "Neither did I," Willow whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "But staying here, pretending that everything is fine, it's killing me." Thomas reached out, hesitating before resting his hand on her shoulder. "I don't want you to go." She looked at him, her heart breaking at the pain in his eyes. "Then why couldn't you show me that you cared? Why did it have to come to this?" He shook his head, at a loss for words. "I thought I was doing the right thing, I thought I could make you happy." Willow wiped her tears, her voice trembling. "I don't blame you, Thomas, but I can't stay here anymore." He nodded slowly, accepting her decision. "Where will you go?" "I'll stay with my parents for now," she replied, her voice steadier. I just need some time to figure things out. Thomas nodded again, a lump forming in his throat. I'll help you pack. They packed her things in silence, the weight of their failed marriage heavy in the air. Willow folded her clothes methodically, trying to keep her emotions in check. Thomas moved around the room, gathering her belongings with a quiet determination. As they finished packing, Willow stood in the doorway, looking around the room one last time. Memories of their brief time together flashed through her mind, the laughter, the arguments, the moments of tenderness that had become so rare. I guess this is it, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded, his eyes downcast. I'm sorry, Willow. I'm sorry it had to end like this. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what came next. Me too, Thomas. But maybe it's for the best. He looked up at her, his expression pained. I'll miss you. Tears filled her eyes again as she walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. I'll miss you too, Thomas. More than you know. They held each other for a moment, clinging to the remnants of their shattered love. Then, with a final bittersweet kiss on the cheek, Willow pulled away and picked up her suitcase. Goodbye, Thomas, she said softly, her voice breaking. Goodbye, Willow, he replied, his voice choked with emotion. And with that she walked out the door, leaving behind the life they had built together and stepping into an uncertain future. Willow's departure marked the end of their tumultuous marriage, but it also marked the beginning of their individual journeys toward healing and self-discovery. For Thomas, it was a wake-up call, a realization of his own shortcomings and the need to confront his emotional barriers. In the weeks that followed, he immersed himself in self-reflection, seeking therapy to unpack the baggage he had carried from his past. He learned to open up, to express his emotions more freely, and to understand the importance of genuine connection in relationships. As for Willow, her time away gave her the space she needed to rediscover herself outside of the confines of marriage. She reconnected with old passions and hobbies, surrounded herself with supportive friends and family, and slowly began to heal from the wounds of her failed marriage. Their story, though painful, served as a catalyst for growth and transformation. It taught them both valuable lessons about love, communication, and the importance of honoring one's own needs and desires. And while their paths diverged, they both emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient than before. They carried the scars of their past, but also the hope of a brighter future filled with authentic connections and genuine happiness. Years later, Thomas and Willow crossed paths unexpectedly at a mutual friend's wedding. They exchanged awkward smiles and tentative hellos, the years of distance evident in their eyes. I heard you moved to the city, Thomas remarked, trying to break the ice. Willow nodded, her smile sad but genuine. Yeah, I did. It's been good for me. He hesitated, unsure of what to say next. I'm glad to hear that. She looked at him, her expression softening. Thomas, I want you to know that I don't regret our time together. Despite everything, you taught me so much about myself. He nodded, a hint of regret in his eyes. I wish things had been different. So do I, she admitted quietly. But we both needed to find our own paths. As they stood together in the quiet corner of the reception, they shared a moment of understanding and closure. Their journey together had been turbulent and painful, but it had also shaped them into the people they had become. With a final nod and a heartfelt goodbye, Thomas and Willow parted ways once more, carrying with them the memories of their past and the hope for a future filled with love, happiness, and fulfillment. Let us know in the comments how this story has inspired you, or share your own experiences of overcoming adversity. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heart-touching stories like this one. Hit the bell icon to stay updated with our latest uploads. Your journey through the complexities of the human heart starts now. Remember, your story isn't over yet. It's just a new chapter beginning. Stay strong, stay inspired.